Carl, scene 3, take 8.
So Carl, LIS, what does the I stand for?
The I is for interdisciplinary, and interdisciplinary means really combining disciplines or subjects together in new and relevant ways to solve problems that can't be solved in any other way.
We believe that we need the brightest young minds in the country coming out of university ready to tackle the most important problems that we face in the world. So we're creating a new university that is designed expressly to teach in a way that's going to help young people tackle those problems.
We'll be in the middle of London, one of the most vibrant cities in the world. We designed the curriculum with some of the top academics in this country and organizations like the Met Police, Virgin, McKinsey and Innocent.
An example of the sort of question we might be tackling at LIS would be around malaria, which is still a massive problem in the developing world. To understand it, you have to understand gene editing, international relations, probabilistic thinking, ecosystems, and you need to be able to put all of these different elements together to be able to tackle the problem.
And just one moment's reflection shows you that you can't really begin to tackle these complex real-world problems without interdisciplinarity.
The whole working world is changing, and I feel sometimes that the higher education system hasn't changed quickly enough.
What we're able to do is talk to top academics from across the country and say, what are the bits from your discipline that you think everybody needs to have? And we can put them all together to bring them to bear to tackle problems.
I love the idea that LIS students will be working on solving real problems and they'll be working collaboratively, and that's so important in disruptive companies.
When I explain the concept of a university to help solve the world's biggest societal problems, people are like, oh yeah, that's something A, I'd like to do, and B, I'd like to hire from.
We get thousands of graduate CVs each year, and it's so much more powerful for someone to show that they've done it than to say that they can.
You only get one chance to be the first student at a university, and what a story to tell to say, I was there right at the beginning.
Why should you hang around at master's level if you can learn this type of thinking earlier on? You will see just how broad and how impactful you can be as a graduate coming out of LIS.
Are you going to take very mature students, Carl? Yeah. Great.
You signed up.
Thank God for that. Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Taylor. I'm the RSA's Chief Executive. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's special event, the last one of this series. Before we kick off, a reminder that we're filming tonight's event and live streaming over the web. That's part of the reason for our delay. I apologize for that. So if you're joining us online, welcome. It's great to have you with us. Please do get involved in the discussion on Twitter. You can let us know your thoughts and questions using the hashtag RSALIS. LIS, of course, stands for our partner on this evening's event, the London Interdisciplinary School. As you'd have seen from the film that's just played, the LIS is pioneering a new polymathic approach to education, bringing together knowledge and frameworks from a range of disciplines to give people the tools for a fast-moving new world of work, one which will only continue to be disrupted by environmental, social, technological, and economic shifts, and where careers will change in multiple ways over a professional life. I'm not sure if LIS expressly timed their launch for the 500th anniversary of the death of perhaps the most iconic polymath in world history. Did you? No? Okay.
We're friendly with Wakass for a while, so we're in synergy.
Right. And that person, of course, is Leonardo da Vinci. But even if it was just a happy accident, it provides a great focus for our conversations tonight. Given the range and complexity of the issues facing us in 2019, it does seem that the time couldn't be more right to update and expand our understanding of polymathy. Polymathy? Is that right? I've got the right emphasis there? Yeah. Not polymathy.
I
say polymathy, but it's...
You say polymathy, I say... Okay, we can all sing that later. But, and then embracing new polymathic ways of thinking and learning and working might just hold the key not only to the individual life, more fully lived, but also to the powerful new connections and collaborations that will be vital to solving our greatest collective social challenges. Now, this is prime territory for the RSA, of course. We are an interdisciplinary institution to our very core. It is in the full name of our organization. Our work draws together a wide range of people and ideas to help understand complex issues in a systemic way, using research insights, convening power to facilitate new ways of thinking about change and to solve problems through co-design and experimentation. So for me, it's a great way to be ending our season this year with this event, because it goes absolutely to the heart of the RSA's concerns and priorities. So we have 4 speakers. They're each going to speak for kind of 7 or 8 minutes. No, 7 now, because we started late. That's your maximum. Then I might ask them a couple of questions, and then we'll bring you in. So first of all, Waqas Ahmed. Waqas is founder of the Da Vinci Network and the author of the acclaimed book, The Polymath, Unlocking the Power of Human Versatility. It's available outside. It is, yeah. And you'll sign it as well, won't you?
Absolutely. For what it's worth.
And he's also artistic director of the Khalili Art Collections and curated the official opening of the Leonardo 500 celebration at the National Gallery earlier this year. I'll introduce people just before they speak rather than introducing everybody so that you know who they are as they speak. So Waqas, why don't you start?
Thank you so much. Matthew, this is important that we have it here. It's an apt venue, not only because of what you mentioned, which is that the RSA is traditionally known for its interdisciplinary thought and discussion, but also because you have some serious polymaths come as members here over history. I mean, Benjamin Franklin comes to mind, of course, who was an entrepreneur, a writer, a publisher, a scientist, an inventor, among many other things. Of course, being one of the founding fathers of the US is what he's known for, but he had an incredibly diverse background. Leonardo da Vinci is interesting because he is the archetype of the polymath in the Western mind, at least. But of course, through my studies, I unearthed polymaths from all over the world, from 15th century West Africa to 19th century Japan, and so on. But I think the 500th anniversary of the death of Leonardo da Vinci provides a very important occasion for us to reflect on not just Leonardo's work and Leonardo's life, but also in his mindset, and why that mindset is important in the 21st century. Before we go into why it's important, because I know my fellow panelists will go into further depth as to why that's important, but I think it's worth providing some context here. The context is that we don't come across many polymaths of that caliber today, and we haven't done in a while. So we need to ask ourselves a question. Why is it that we haven't come across? Why does our society not produce such minds? There's a long history that I won't go into, and yes, indeed, my book does, but the crux of it, or at least in Western history, we had the Industrial Revolution, which brought with it a variety of benefits and drawbacks. Now, one of the drawbacks, I'd say probably the biggest drawback, is its limiting impact on human potential. The reason I say that is because industrial capitalism brought with it a certain organizational framework, which is largely based on the division of labor. Now, the division of labor is an interesting way of organizing a workforce, but what it does is it segregates different fields, different disciplines, and indeed different identities into closed boxes. And in doing so, it limits that individual as to what they could potentially do. Of course, we are all multifaceted human beings. Well, human beings are multifaceted beings in general. We know that. Sociologists, behavioral scientists, evolutionary biologists will tell us the same thing. But why is it then that we are then confined by society, whether it be our education system, whether it be the workplace, parents, popular culture, whatever it might be? Why does it discourage the exploration of our many sides? Well, now, in the 21st century, we're starting to revisit this concept of the polymath. I should define the polymath very quickly. There are many definitions of it, but the more sort of general, universal one would be a person of exceptional versatility who therefore excels in various seemingly unrelated fields. Now, this can apply in different contexts and in different ways, but the reason why the polymath is important today is because not only are we as individuals seeking self-actualization, a kind of fulfillment that allows us to be the best we can possibly be, and as I said, who we are is a multitude, is not a one-dimensional concept. So if we want to be the best we can be, we should inevitably be a multitude of things, whether those things be our professional fields, whether those things be what we study and how we bring that knowledge together, or whether it be just our social identities. So with this individual fulfillment, this self-actualization, we are then better placed to make a solid contribution or a creative contribution to society in a manner that we would not have been able to do if we were constrained as one-dimensional beings. So that leads me to the benefit of the polymath for society. Now, better qualified panelists here will explore why this is important for society, and indeed, certain solutions are being proposed and certain initiatives have begun, including the LIS. So, for society, in short, world problems, as you saw in the video, are multidimensional. They have various facets to them, every single one of them. In order to tackle those world problems, we are not going to be able to do so if we focus on one specific aspect of it and then move on to the other. We have to be able to simultaneously address these various facets, see how they might be synthesized in order to derive a creative solution to that problem. A specialist, and by specialist, I don't mean someone who specializes in their field and has in-depth knowledge, because that is a very noble thing. A specialist, i.e. a lifelong specialist, and specialization as a system that segregates different fields of knowledge, different professions and identities, is nothing short of intellectual and professional apartheid. So, what are we doing? Are we unlocking human potential in its various forms today? Are we allowing for that self-actualization at the individual level to happen? Are we then allowing for that multidimensional mind, once prepared in this way, to then tackle multidimensional problems? I would say currently no, which is why we have so many such problems today. So we need to explore why it is that this happens, that we are where we are today, and what is the way in which we ought to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, one obvious question, Wakas, and it may be that Carl will speak about this in terms of the design of the curriculum, but I think it's said sometimes that Spinoza was the last person to know everything. Leonardo could know just about everything that was known, in a sense. We're not in that world anymore. There's more science being undertaken in the last 10 years than has been undertaken in the previous history of the human race. So how does this notion of polymath work in a world where there's an abundance of knowledge?
Sure. Well, firstly, the fact that one person can know everything is a myth. That's never happened in human history. Leonardo may have known many things, Spinoza and whoever else you quote might have known many things. But of course, the world hadn't globalized culturally and geographically in that way. So what did Spinoza know about 5th century Japanese philosophy? Or what did Leonardo know about South African history? Nothing. So we cannot approach it from that angle. The way we need to approach it is how, firstly, is information or is knowledge available in an exponential form, in a way that can be at least understood and, most importantly, brought together to make sense or to generate some form of wisdom for a particular problem. And I think that's the important thing with LIS as well, where it's going to have a curriculum based on problems rather than on disciplines, so that you can then understand, okay, what aspects of the world, what aspects of knowledge will be needed in order to derive a creative outcome. So I think although knowledge has grown exponentially in those centuries, so has access to it.
Great, thank you very much. We'll bring you back into the conversation slightly later. So Ella Saltmarsh is a trained anthropologist. She's a writer, founder of a wide range of networks and projects, including the Point People, the Comms Lab, the Long Time Project, with most of her work sitting at the intersection of creativity, narrative, and this phrase, systems change. You help us, indeed, at the RSA think about systems change, Ella. So It's a term I use a lot, but it's also a term that kind of, I think, can be overused and misapplied. Help us.
Well, let's start by talking about being plural, and we'll come to systems at the end. So I'm going to give an account of what it's like, the lived experience of being plural. And I'm actually going to start about 15 years ago, which is when I first realized I had some issues. So I'd like you to rewind. It was 15 years ago. So the speed dating event that I was at was a Sex and the City speed dating event. And so it meant you had 5 minutes with each person. And so the bell rang, I sat down, I was opposite this nice, quite awkward young doctor. He asked me what I did, and I told him I was an underwater documentary maker. And he was really intrigued, as was I, because this was not true. Like, I was not an underwater documentary maker. So the bell rang, I moved on, then I was a PhD candidate, then I was a journalist, and finally, before I had time to elect myself into office, the bell rang, it was all over. And so the next morning, once my tequila hangover had worn off, I kind of reflected on what had just happened because, compulsive lying isn't normally how I roll. And I attributed my speed dating dishonesty to be a mixture of shame and utility. So sitting opposite a stranger with 5 minutes on the clock, it felt easier to lie about what I did, not because my occupation was scandalous, but because it was plural. I did and do many different things, and it often takes more than 5 minutes to talk about them. So over the kind of following years, whilst I never lied that blatantly again, I'd often find myself only telling part of the truth to people, because I somehow thought that my plurality was a sign of immaturity, that one day I would grow up and do one thing and be admitted into the realm of adulthood. I really thought that I had to cull my skills in order to gain credibility in the world. And I think life started to teach me that that wasn't the case. And so about 8 years ago, I kind of came out as being plural, and I did a TED Talk, and I did that because I really felt that I wanted to start to challenge this idea that, that you couldn't have impact in the world if you did many things, that somehow it diminished your impact, when in my experience, it's amplified it. And so one of the interesting things for me has been to see how this space has changed over the last 8 years. So when I first started to talk to people about being plural, it was very much a kind of credibility thing. I was trying to convince people that this was important for the world. Whereas now, when I talk to groups of people, especially young people, they're like, yeah, this is our life. We have to live in this way. Many people do not have a choice but to be plural. And so I think it's interesting to think about the factors that are pulling us and the factors that are pushing us to a more plural way of being. So I think when we're looking at the push, there is a clear economic push. So, whether you are someone who is having to hold down multiple jobs that require very different skills just to survive, which is an increasing number of people. But also, given that I heard a crazy stat the other day, 2/3 of kids in US elementary schools are going to be going into careers that don't yet exist. We are all going to probably have to be plural in our lifetimes, just to keep up with this rapidly transforming economy. So we're being pushed there. But we're obviously also being pulled there, partly by this kind of desire for self-actualization, but also because the world demands it of us. The kinds of problems that we face today, in some ways, are the problems of the 20th century. It's the problems that a very kind of reductionist mindset created. And now we are needing to tackle them with a very different approach. And so that is what that's what I end up doing a lot of. And so I thought I'd talk about one project to give a very practical example, perhaps of the messiness, but hopefully the usefulness of being plural. So this is a project that happened at the time of the last snap election in the UK. So that was when we were told 6 weeks before election day that an election was coming. And for anyone who was concerned about young people's participation in politics, it was a very worrying time. You know, we'd had the Brexit referendum, young people's turnout hadn't been great. How on earth were we going to get young people to turn out? And so I remember the day after the election was announced, I ended up going to an emergency event that was held in a civic tech place. And civic tech isn't my thing, but because I have wide networks, because I do many things, I heard about it. So I went to this event. I had some weird ideas that I spoke to some people about, and one of the people I spoke to about a few days later connected me with some other people who'd had some similar quite weird ideas. And so then we had a call together, this group of people, most of us didn't know each other, and we decided that we were going to do a campaign that was focusing on young women's political participation. So young women are the least likely demographic to vote, and they're the most progressive when they turn out. So we figured that would be a double win. By this point, we had 3 weeks to go till election day. We had no money, you know, we had no organisation. We all were very busy working in our day jobs. And so we created an emergency election hack. We got a planner who worked in advertising, who happened to be able to do the job because she was in hospital that day. And in her hospital bed, she wrote us the brief. And again, because I span these different worlds through my work, we were able to invite people from advertising, entertainment, and PR to this emergency election hack. Amazingly, they all came, and by the end of the evening, there were huge numbers of projects that were happening. And the next morning, we woke up and we were like, oh, this is a thing, and it should have a name. Let's call it She Votes. And over the next week, I have never been involved in anything that has scaled so quickly. So we had, I don't know, we had nail salons doing She Votes manicures, bakers doing She Votes donuts. I ended up producing a comedy video based in a ladies' toilet with 10 female comedians. I have never made a comedy video in my life. And I guess this is part of what it's like to be plural, working in an emergent way, tackling the problems that we face. The campaign ended up reaching 15 million people on a budget of 6K for a week's launch. I mean, I've never been involved in anything like it. And the reason that I'm sharing it is because it only happened because of these very diverse networks that we were able to mobilize, and the way we were able to be so adaptable to what life was throwing at us. So I think when we hear talk of polymath, it can feel quite abstract and like it's about really brainy people in ivory towers. And I think it's so important that we situate this debate back in the world of the problems that we face today, which is why LIS is so important. And I think one thing I wanted to say before I finished is that I think it's really important that we talk about the link between plurality and precarity. Because one of the things that I sometimes feel uncomfortable about is that I come out and talk about how personally meaningful it is to be so plural, how it's good for the world, without also talking about how generally, if you're a plural person, it almost necessitates a kind of quite precarious lifestyle. And actually, after that first TED Talk, I had to do loads of firefighting with all these people sending me emails saying they were about to quit their jobs. And I was like, no, like, don't do that. And so I think it's really important that at the moment, institutions are not set up to deal with plurality. And so this conversation also needs to be a conversation about 21st century safety nets, which is why it's very good that we're having it here. Because we have to find ways of being able to institutionalize this approach so that we don't actually end up having people being very plural, but also very precarious.
Great, thank you very much. I'll resist the temptation to get into conversation about universal basic income, but I was interested in Wakas's answer to my question, which is how can you be a polymath in an era of knowledge overload. And your answer, Wakas, I think was, well, don't think about the person, think about the problem. So what is the knowledge you need to solve the problem? I want to ask you kind of a slightly prosaic question. How do you decide what not to read, what not to do, who not to speak? This is the kind of Netflix problem. You know, we no longer live in a world where the problem is what do I want to read and do and watch. The problem is what do I not want to read and do and watch. How do you, personally, how do you deal with it? You could be dragged in a million directions. You must have some techniques, some tricks that you use to stop that happening.
Such a good question. I have very clear lines of inquiry. So I guess being plural doesn't mean doing everything. And whilst you might be interested in lots of things, yeah, I guess I have very clear lines of inquiry. I have very clear problems that I'm seeking to tackle in any one moment. So I can be quite strategic about those decisions. You know, is it going to help me tackle this problem that I am passionate about?
So certainly this question of how it is we decide which knowledge to try to access in a world of knowledge overload is one of the questions that we obviously need to be thinking, that we need to be talking to young people about. That's a challenge for them. Carl is murmuring at me that he's going to address that himself. Very good. Okay, in time. Our next speaker is my friend Georgia Gould. Georgia is Councillor for Kentish Town Ward, Leader of Camden Council, Deputy Chair of London Councils, where she's also Executive Member for Skills and Employment. Georgia has made a STEAM agenda. You know, everyone know what a STEAM agenda is? It's STEM with A in it for arts.
Putting the arts into
Right.
STEM.
That's precisely, arts into STEM. Central to making, and she's put that idea of the STEAM agenda at the heart of making sure local young people in Camden get the skills and opportunities they need to play a full part in the borough's thriving, creative, digital and scientific economy. Given that you don't actually control what schools do at all, how are you going about this, Georgia?
Yeah, well, we're very much in a collaborative approach. So listening to this discussion, I've started to think that Camden is a bit of a polymaths paradise. I've not something I've thought about before.
Would that be your new, you drive into Camden, Polymaths paradise.
I feel like, I feel that's going to really kind of have resonance with the community. Yeah. We ran politics as Polymathy, is that right? I mean, I go from dog mess to adult social care, that counts, right? But because we have in Camden a rich mix of cultural, scientific, technological institutions and organisations, and we always have had, but there's been a kind of exponential growth in the last few years around King's Cross and Holborn and Euston, and that is kind of had us talked about as being one of the foremost innovation districts in the UK and one of the biggest concentration of that kind of mix of different institutions in the world. And I think a lot of why people want to come to Camden, why people are excited about the economy is because of the links, is because of the knowledge institutions. We have the big cultural institutions like the British Museum, Francis Crick, the biggest biomedical science research centre in Europe, and then universities like Central St Martin's and the way that interacts. So for us, it's a massive challenge of how we make sure all of that innovation is working for our residents. And when we think about interdisciplinary, we think about different disciplines coming together. But for me, in a place like Camden, which has huge poverty and huge wealth and growth, it's the connection between our communities and those kind of pioneering institutions is really critical. And how, I have residents who talk about them feeling like an island of poverty in between glass and feel really shut out of that innovation and growth. And one of the things that I always say to people who come into Camden is don't make the mistake of thinking all the creativity is in those institutions. Actually, so much of it is in our communities. And I think having interdisciplinary teams also means you need mixed teams, diverse teams that are going to look at problems from different angles. And so the big challenge we set ourselves as a council is how do we bring together all the resource in our place, Camden, our citizens, their creativity, and some of these institutions that span so many different disciplines to solve big challenges, challenges locally, but also beyond. And so our plan, our vision is not one for the council, is one for the place. And it's written by citizens. We have a number of challenges that they've set, and we work to bring together coalitions to solve those challenges. And that's a different way to work as a local authority. It means we're a convener, coalition builder, sometimes community organiser. And the role, I think, of relationships and bridging in this new world is critically important, because different places and people speak different languages, and we need to invest in the resource that is going to bridge those gaps and create a kind of unified force to look at these challenges. One of them being, how do we make sure that growth is open to our young people? And these places aren't just places they walk past on their way to school, but places they kind of go into, they aspire to work in, they get inspiration, they get skills, and one day they're part of. And in Camden, we've set up something called Camden Learning, which is a coalition of our schools. Our schools have generally stayed with the local authority, and it's owned by the schools and the council together, and we look together at different issues. So we have mental health hubs and hubs looking at a whole range of areas, but one of them is our STEAM hub, and we created it because we felt that for our young people, a 21st century education needed to be one that gave them access to these different disciplines, that meant they had understanding of technical skills, but also creativity and the ability to bring what you get from the arts to these big societal challenges. And so we talked about fusion skills, you call them hybrid skills, but Carl was actually on our original STEAM commission, so he helped us create it. But there was huge buy-in from some of our employers and our schools, and we spent a lot of time bringing them together, creating a curriculum hub where teachers work together across arts, sciences, drama, a whole range of different disciplines to develop the STEAM agenda with some of the universities and employers on our doorstep. And we set a number of STEAM challenges that young people work on together. And it's been so powerful seeing the way that it changes the curriculums beyond the STEAM work, and the teachers are incredibly excited about these challenges, and our young people take them to a different place. And I was recently at our launch of some of the kind of an exhibition really of a STEAM work, and what really struck me was everything the young people had worked on, often with employers, was all about big challenges. So they were about the Sustainable Development Goals, and they were about the climate crisis, and the young people naturally kind of took that interdisciplinary thinking and applied it to real world problems. And I think that's what happens when you create those connections, because we have so many issues that we face, and we will only solve them if we work together and harness that creativity. So we're really excited about kind of the movement that the young people are leading, but it has a kind of whole circle to our whole economy in place. So when I talk to employers coming into the borough, I say, well, we want you to come to Camden if you want to work with us to solve those challenges, and you have this approach to young people, and you're part of our neighbourhood and family. So we're starting to get people coming to the borough because they want to be part of that journey, and I'm desperate to get you guys in the borough, so we're trying, we're kind of plugging away. But I think more broadly, thinking about adults, which we're also doing, and we are doing a UBI trial, so we can discuss a bit more about that, but thinking about how we give that opportunity to our residents more widely. And one of the projects we do with Central St Martin's, we set up a civic collaboration lab, and I love design thinking, because where the kind of young designers come to our problems where there would be big kind of political blocks and that kind of moment of tension that as politicians we might back away from, and they're like, well, that tension is where you get the creativity, and so they really lean into it. And they're looking at problems with our communities. So, for example, overcrowded housing. They've created this whole kind of range of furniture that supports overcrowded families to have privacy and to be able to live in really difficult circumstances. And we've just created with them a maker space in the middle of the British Library, which will be open to anyone. It has a huge amount of technology and tools, but it's there to be a kind of connection point between some of the makers that are kind of generating value in the economy and people from our community who are also makers, and giving them that opportunity, space and connection. So it's a different role for councils, and it's an emerging journey, but I think it's something that we're really committed to.
Thank you, George. Thank you. That's a wonderfully different kind of description of how local authority works from, I think, the image that some people might have in their minds. I mean, George, how much of this is around simply the question of kind of access and inequality? I remember sadly, Miss Tessa Jow once saying that probably the single biggest inequality in education was music, because basically, if you were poor, you couldn't afford music tuition. There wasn't much going on in schools, whereas most middle-class kids, as part of their kind of development, would learn to play the piano or whatever it might be. And then another angle of this is that actually schools still try, most of them, to have some kind of arts element going on in school in some way, but it tends to be that when working class people leave school, that they don't have the relationship with arts institutions, that they don't go anymore, as it were, even if they've kind of been taken to theatre during their school education. So I'm just interested in the connection between STEAM, the A in STEAM, and your commitment to kind of social justice and inclusion.
Yeah, I think it's all for me about tackling inequality. Like, the big challenge for me is these young people are growing up in Camden with all of this resource around them, but so many feel completely alienated from it. So like, our job is to make sure that they have a part of that. And you know, that's not the experience in Camden. I was in a school the other day and went into a year 5 class, and the entire class were learning together brass instruments, and they've been learning for a year, and they were just amazing. And that it's about making sure that all of our young people get the same access. So that means kind of supplementing, make sure each young person has a musical instrument. And because the national agenda isn't supporting it, we have to bring in resource outside of the education system to make that happen. But the reality is that in most places that isn't happening, and you're fighting against huge forces of inequality, because you know, still a young person who's living in that deeply overcrowded household doesn't have anywhere to practice and doesn't have the kind of same level of access. So I think that the role we can play as a state to kind of make those relationships and connections is incredibly important, but also as kind of people move through their life, giving them the opportunity to take a step back out of, you know, there's massive issues of in-work poverty. You know, 58% of Londoners who are in poverty are in working households, and people are stuck in that low pay and aren't able to kind of develop all of these wider opportunities. But what we have found is where arts can be incredibly liberating to bring communities together. So we're doing a program called Walls on Walls in our estates, which is like community art projects, and the way that they form connections and the way that, you know, talent is unearthed from that and change people's perception of place is so incredibly powerful. So there's a kind of elitist idea sometimes that, you know, these are kind of middle class pursuits, but that's absolutely not the case. It's about access to those kind of tools and time and opportunities.
It's really interesting. We're doing a piece of work here at the RSA on heritage and inclusive growth, which sounds like a strange combination, but actually when we talk about inclusive growth, it's too often simply a socio-economic concept, but actually inclusion's about a feeling of belonging and of connection to place, interestingly, people really get animated by heritage. You ask any group of people, however long they've lived in an area, wherever they're from, what do you think we should keep? What do you think matters? What do you think we should preserve? And everyone's got a view. It's a wonderfully kind of demotic issue. Anyway, we could just carry on chatting, couldn't we? That'll be a future event. Last but not least, Carl Gombrich. Is it k or ch?
Depends how European you want to be.
Well, no, it depends what you want. Gombrich, very good. Last but not least, Carl Gombrich. Carl is head of learning at the London Interdisciplinary School. We saw his head floating around, kind of rather Voldemort style in the video. But before joining the school's founding team, Carl pioneered interdisciplinary arts and sciences degrees at UCL. I met a student of yours a few months ago, and I couldn't stop her talking about how wonderful her degree had been. He himself has degrees in maths, physics, and philosophy. That just makes me so envious. And before entering academia, was a professional opera. Oh, Carl, this is ridiculous. Did you play for which Premier League football team?
I for Oxford with Martin Keown and Gary Parker when I was 11 years old. I've got the photo on my phone if you want to see it. That's actually the thing I'm most proud of. It's a bit sad, but after 11 years old, I wasn't so good.
Well, Carl, what can I say? Over to you.
Thanks, Matthew.
How can we have more people like you, Carl? I guess that's the question.
Well, it's funny you say that, actually, because I'm deeply inspired by what my fellow panelists have just said, and it's difficult for me not to kind of go off on a riff on everything they've said, so I'll try to keep it on the island to my 7 minutes. And just to address 3 things. Our notions of expertise, education, and perhaps why these things are all being challenged and problematized now in the way which the panelists have spoken about so eloquently. So I think this is hard stuff. We're reframing some very fundamental beliefs about knowledge and our experience growing up in the world. We're educated in school in subjects like maths and biology and English literature. And when we go to university, we do something like history or economics. And the idea that these things are really, really contingent, and that in periods of tremendous change, such as we're looking at now in the often called Fourth Industrial Revolution, such as things that the RSA writes about, these very fundamental mental categories of knowledge actually start to dissolve. That idea is extremely challenging, and it gets us to really ask some very fundamental questions about what constitutes knowledge, what knowledge has value, how we come to that knowledge, and so on. So I may be preaching to the converted here, but I'm conscious, because of my life the last 10 years, that whenever we have this kind of conversation, which we're all kind of really into about, yeah, you can do so many things really well and connect the dots and so on, there are people in the audience who just kind of think, yeah, but you do need expertise. You really do need to be expert in one thing to contribute. And so I just want to give you two kind of pushes back on that. It's not that I'm against expertise at all. In fact, I think to make a worthwhile contribution, you have to be an expert in some ways, in something, or maybe a multiple expert, but certainly have expertise. What I do think we need to push back on very strongly is the idea that you get that expertise for the rest of your life from studying 1 or even 3 subjects at school, from 16 to 18, 3 subjects, and then generally 1 subject at university. There's always been a problem with this, so whatever subject you studied at university, generally the department would make an argument about transferable skills. You'd learn by doing subject X, and I never like to pick on a particular subject because that's unfair, but every academic has their subjects that this is incredibly important, which it is to them, and you'll also learn, how to write very well, how to work with other people, how to handle data for the real world afterwards. There's something transferable here. But it was always kind of a cheat. And the reality is you just do not need to study 1 subject to have expertise in the rest of your life. And in fact, you're probably best not served by studying just 1 subject. I mean, should you really go through a degree in the humanities these days and never open a spreadsheet or never understand what an algorithm is? Should you really go through a science degree and never write a qualitative paper or think about the ethics of what you're doing? So these things are really fundamentally being challenged now in terms of our educational structures. But I'd like to make also a more positive point, and I see one of my wonderful students in the audience. Thank you for being here. The most exciting expertise is actually got by combining existing disciplines in these new, very current ways. So from the UCL degree which I ran, we have people going straight onto PhDs from 3-year undergraduate courses in things like AI, human behavior, and energy consumption. What is the intersection between automated ways of thinking about how we use energy and the human psychology of interacting with those ways? So that person needs to study something about artificial intelligence, data science, human behavior, energy, vastly different disciplines from the academy, and synthesize them in an interesting way. I have another PhD student at Oxford doing climate change resilience in small island states. She studied environmental concerns from engineering perspectives, legal perspectives, sociological perspectives, economic perspectives, and she's actually at a very young age regularly now consulting for the United Nations and the World Bank, because she's got expertise in a very modern, contemporary sense, which is synthesizing existing knowledge and existing disciplines. So I really think we need to put to bed the idea that you don't get valuable expertise unless you study one subject, such as the sort that we've all grown up with and were roughly established somewhere between 1800 and 1950, depending on how you look at it. This is very, very important, of course, for education. How we restructure the world of education to reflect these boundaries which are being challenged is a tremendous challenge. And people get nervous when you start erasing old boundaries because they think it's going to turn into a great big grey goo where no one will learn anything, or they'll learn a bit of this and a bit of that. And this touches on something Matthew was sort of hinting at earlier. What do we do to get the kind of education that these people need to then make these really interesting syntheses later on, become experts or multiple experts in different areas? And that is a huge challenge. I certainly don't claim to have the answer to this yet, but I think it's important that all of us who are progressives in this space keep in mind that we want rigorous education. You've got to learn hard stuff. And in fact, there's quite a good correlation between learning and hard mental work. The harder you have to work mentally, the more you're learning. So one thing we're doing at LIS, I think we're looking at this from sort of both the top and the bottom. From the sort of bottom end, the kind of tools end, we want to teach methods. Methods can be qualitative, so ethnography, videography, survey design, interview techniques. How can you teach young people to have the tools to both go and generate their own knowledge, but also when they read papers in anthropology or sociology, to know the methods behind by which the knowledge was gained. Once you have confidence in those tools and the methods by which the knowledge was gained, you can read pretty confidently now in a very wide area of knowledge quite early on in your educational career. You don't need to sit back, let people feed you the information or even point you in the right direction of the papers. And of course there's also, and I always introduce this gently, perhaps wrongly in an arts institution, but there's also hard methods. You can't escape these days learning about data science, the statistics behind machine learning. Thankfully, these things are now being explained extremely well. There's a great piece on Medium called Machine Learning for Humans by a guy who then joined DeepMind. He wrote the piece as a kind of a job application and then got the job. But we all need to understand this stuff. Without understanding this stuff, no one in this room really knows the decisions that are being made on their behalf at the moment. And it's not just about tech. I'm probably preaching to the converted here. This is political, it's aesthetic, it's ethical, and so on. But again, armed with those tools, you can go and read papers about economics. You can read some papers about physics. And so the methods is the kind of bottom end, the hardcore I think we need to teach. Not necessarily self-consciously devoid of where their disciplinary roots are, but kind of gently ignoring that. Right? Some of them come out of mathematics, some might come out of sociology. It doesn't really matter. The tools are what matter. And I think the higher end, the conceptual end, is this sort of complex real-world problem approach. What kind of mindset, what kind of systems thinking, the sort of thing Ella's referred to. Actor network theory is another way of approaching this. What kind of cross-disciplinary concepts, mindsets, working patterns, working habits, some people call this post-disciplinary. What kind of these, they are more abstract, they're more conceptual, but that's a good thing for a university to do. What can we give those to students as well? So then they can marry their kind of high-level conceptual thinking with these really hardcore tools they have underneath and really generate their own knowledge, their own interdisciplinary knowledge, attack these complex real-world problems in a really sophisticated way. And this gives them also a kind of individual education, which is also uniquely valuable. I've lost track now of the number of my graduates who said, I went for this interview, and they were just about to tick, what degree did you do? Economics, law. And they said arts and sciences, and they went, oh yeah, what's that then? And then the students say, well, I did a really interesting exploration of poverty alleviation from economic and anthropological and sociological perspectives, and suddenly Deloitte's are interested, World Bank are interested in you. So this kind of individual education is also quite a current thing. You're not just a number, you have your individual synthesis of knowledge. So my last point, very briefly, is kind of why I think this is happening. This is a hard, well, perhaps not that hard, but perhaps somewhat hard revolution to quantify. We all know the stuff about new knowledge coming along every 6 months. It's a bit more than all the knowledge that's happened in the past. There's also, of course, much greater connectivity across people, cultures, generations. And what you generally see is that innovation happens when there are connections, and in particularly when there are kind of near connections that people can make. So and this also goes back to expertise. We conceive of the value of expertise of people being at the cutting edge of something very, very minutely specialized. But the vast majority of innovation comes from people combining and recombining existing knowledge from surprising areas. So you all know probably the example of the printing press, which was invented by the wine press, being repurposed and putting print on the underside. And you squizzled down the thing which pressed the wine, and lo and behold, you were printing sheets, and before you know it, you had the print revolution. And we see this again and again and again in the world outside universities, that creative people in startups, in industry, are combining this extraordinary universe of knowledge we all live in now to create valuable new products, to innovate. And as Stephen Berlin-Johnson said, you know, chance favors the connected mind. So the more connected in thinking you can make your students across all these disciplines, the more likely you are to have a valuable creative output from their education. So that's what I just wanted to end with.
Thank you. Just one question from me, Colin, then we'll open it up to the room. Like I said at the beginning, that part of the reason for polymathy is that it's good for you. It's good for the individual. You know, we talk about these big social challenges and the needs of the world, but actually it makes you a fuller and rounder human being. But in a way, at certain times when you were talking just then, it did sound a little bit like it was just for very clever people. And one of the things that one notices about society is how often people, when they retire, feel they now have the space to do the stuff they weren't able to do during their life. They suddenly take up, you know, drawing or language or whatever it might be. And also the phenomenon that used to be of blokes in their garden sheds, where they would go out and do bits of kind of science and craft in the garden shed that wasn't really any longer relevant in their work or whatever. Is this for everybody? And in what sense is it for everybody, given that you said it 3 or 4 times, this is really hard stuff?
I mean, it's a fair question. I think I have to be honest that we have to confront the fact that we are in a knowledge economy now, and this plays into the whole kind of future and work, which I know this event is about. So I don't want to downplay the fact that this is a somewhat intellectual exercise. I think both Wakas and Ella will have interesting things to say about the individual developing, and not necessarily this being a kind of hyper-specialized middle-class thing. But at the same time, we're, I think, all aware of the threat to manual labor and routinized clerical labor. And so there is a challenge to the whole world in this space, this industrialized societies, of how we get all of us to be more polymathic in our thinking, because if we aren't, the chances are your job will be routinized and you will be out of a job. It's really as simple as that.
Where do you think kind of care, relationships and compassion come in that? Because I think that actually when employers talk about that, but actually there's so much of where we're going, which is about how we care for each other, and where does that sit in our learning and our connection?
Hold on to that.
Okay.
Treat it as if it was a question from the audience. Time has come to hear from views from within the room. But before we start, and I'm not going to test you on this, how many people in the room think they are a polymath? Put your hands up.
See, I don't. Wakas told me I'm in a polymathic profession, but I'm not a real polymath.
Okay, interesting.
I didn't say you're not a polymath.
Okay.
No, I respected what you said.
Enough. Right. Okay. So if I can ask you to keep your questions as short as possible, and panel, because of time, I'm not going to bring you back until the end. So listen to all the questions and then just pick out a couple, just a couple that you want to respond to at the end, and that's how we'll get quite a lot of comments in. Let's start over there, right at the back, white T-shirt.
Okay. So my question is,
Tell us who you are. Sorry.
Sorry,
Tell us who you are.
Yeah, my name is Aldrin Shumba. I work for Invesco. And my question is, why do we need polymaths if we can all be experts who can collaborate?
Oh, okay, interesting. And then let's hand the microphone to the person immediately in front of you. I'm being lazy, but there's someone right. That's it. Very good.
I'm reminded of...
Tell us who you are.
I'm Alex. I previously worked for the RSA, and I'm very much in interested in this world of polymathy. Something I'm interested in is Bertrand Russell's idea of knowledge by acquaintance versus knowledge by description. And I think he positions knowledge by description as kind of this abstract knowledge, you come at knowledge. Whereas knowledge by acquaintance is again, these are represented by the Latinate verbs in French, savoir and connaître. Savoir is you know about something, and connaître is I know this person, or I know how to do this thing. And I think Goethe is probably the best example we have.
This is such a great question.
Of,
I mean, I'm sure there is a question in there waiting to come out. But
what I'm really interested in is do we need a kind of intimacy? I think Georgia was mentioning this kind of place-based knowledge. Does the pursuit of polymathy require a kind of return to a kind of seductive approach towards education? We now live in a world where information confronts us daily. Do we once again have to come back into a relationship with knowledge, which is one of kind of being seduced by it?
Wow. Okay, Carl, that's definitely your question. Although Wackers, you might want as well. Right, we'll take two down here, one of which is from the internet.
We have a question from Twitter to Carl, and it's from Nico McDonald. And he says, what new demands and skills does the LIS approach demand of tutors, and which aspects of the flipped classroom does it embrace?
Very good, and now pass the microphone over there.
Did I hear you
So tell us who you are and point it at your
Vikram
mouth.
Shah.
Yeah.
Did I hear you mutter under your breath the word universal basic income?
I didn't muster it. I'm proud and out about it. Yeah.
I think that is probably an answer to allow a lot of people to explore themselves and become polymath or whatever they want to become. So would the panel agree or not? Is the
Very
question.
good, thank you for that. Okay, there's a woman here, lady here. So let's bring the mic there. Very good.
Hello. Just to react to
Tell us who you are.
Jenny Conway, retired. I used to be a journalist, television. How would you react to, obviously, more money going into schools, but teaching geography in German, maths in French, and so on, which they do in some schools, that kind of thing, that improves the brain, and that will make it. And I was very lucky at my school. My teacher changed the curriculum. I went to a fantastic school. She changed the curriculum. I could do Russian and French and chemistry and maths as well at A-level. Very, very, very difficult to do. She changed the curriculum. It's impossible to do that now. Impossible. She wouldn't be able to do it now. And so the suggestions of that kind of thing, that you've got to mix arts and sciences at school at a early age, and music.
Thank you very much for that. Oh, look at all these hands, and we've hardly got any time, but I'm going to favour women. So they're just here. Very good. Yep.
Hi, Romy from EdTechX. My question is about the role of technology in all of this. You had a statistic that we don't know 2/3 of jobs by 2050. And that's because of technology. We don't know what technology is going to be like in the workplace by maybe 2030. So how do you find a, I guess, proportional role to hard education and that sort of role of geography and history, polymathy in terms of wide knowledge and learning, but then also transient knowledge, acquired knowledge, and the knowledge that you keep for years to come? How do you find that perfect, I guess, algorithm that fits it all together?
Great. I'm going to make myself very unpopular by choosing this gentleman here in the front row as the final question, because we're supposed to be finishing now, and we will bring, I've been told I can, okay, my goodness, this really is polymathy and pluralism, and okay, so I'll have this guy as well, because he's had his hand up for the full 10 minutes. Right, go.
Hello, I'm Tony Drewer. I'm struck by the similarity with what you're saying with the Lunar Society in the 1850s that was operation in Birmingham. Is
and
there
still
anything,
going.
Is there anything, do you think, that you can learn from that particular organisation or group of people?
Okay, and it is still going, because I've spoken to them, I think.
The Lunar Society.
In Birmingham, yeah. I think so. Anyway, yes, there.
Hi, Chris Steed. Wonderful, wonderful presentation, really stimulating. I'm in academia now, but I've not always been. I've done a lot and written a lot in my time, but I don't think I could have done any of it or much of it. If I had just been in academia, in other words, in one stream, I think all that I've done is been achieved because mostly I've been outside of academia. So I work in the social field and on a kind of a design for a hub of hope, tackling loneliness and disconnect in society. Well, that's a great example of where you can bring multiple ideas to bear.
Great. Yes, I think how you need to, this is a good point.
Can I answer all the questions?
Is being an academic itself a denial? I mean, Ken Robinson, doesn't he? Ken Robinson says in that wonderful lecture that academics treat their bodies simply as a way of moving their brains around, for example. So, Carl, you can start, but you can only have two or three questions at the most, because we mustn't go over past 7:20.
I want to answer all the questions. Thank you. They're brilliant. I'm not going to diss academics, right? I'm from a very, very academic family. I'm the least achieving academic for 3 generations on both sides in my family, and they're good academics too, so I'm not going to diss them. But I think with this massification of higher education, you've got a real problem, because academics is not what suits most people. It's the sort of things I talked about before, polymathic skills, combining things in individual ways. So I don't know. I'm not going to bite on that one. Do we want the really theoretical discussion between me and the gentleman at the back about acquaintance?
You can have look, I'll tell you what, when we go for a drink afterwards, will the two of you meet up and then we'll have a little huddle around you, speaking to the notion of intimacy and seduction, and so you do that downstairs, okay?
There's a very interesting modern equivalent, Harry Collins and interactive expertise, so we'll talk about that. So the teaching thing, I think that's an interesting question. Was it the Twitter question? Hurrah. So I think this is a really important challenge, and it's something we want to meet head on. So in looking for our faculty, we actually advertise for polymathic young scholars, teachers and researchers. And we want to recognize that in the room with your students, the smartest thing in the room will be their mobile phone or the internet. It will never be the teacher or the student in many, many, many ways. There is, of course, a specialism which the academic will have, and of course we're hiring people who have some of the current specialisms we're interested in, whether it's sort of psychology or environmentalism or whatever. But even then, we want to hire people that are thinking outside very narrow subject specialisms. And we're actually going to say, you will be challenged pretty much daily, if not weekly, by having students coming to you saying, I found this resource to tackle this real-world problem. Say it's knife crime. And they're talking to a psychologist who's found an anthropological resource. What do you think about this? And then the teacher has to think, what do I think about this? What do I know about it? How can I find its credibility? How do I know it's been well researched? There's a whole kind of meta question around search here and about the availability of knowledge, which you hinted at right at the beginning, which is absolutely crucial. I saw in the World Economic Forum report just yesterday that paid search is now a job category. Googling is a great skill. There are entire companies that hire expert Googlers now. So we shouldn't be embarrassed about that. It's not that Google is, useless and all the information is kind of at a low level and untrustworthy. It's knowing how to use Google. And I think modern teachers have an extremely important role in recognizing that and being expert at search, alongside what I think will be some interdisciplinary specialisms which will require of our teachers. I'm really sorry not to talk about care. I'd love to talk about that too, but we haven't got time.
George, I'm particularly interested in you answering the question, which is implicitly that for head teachers or school leaders to do any of this requires them to be rebels, in a way. They have to kind of push against how the national frameworks of performance and measurement and...
Yeah, no, when we were just having a discussion with all the teachers who'd been part of our STEAM Hub, they all talked about the courage that it had taken to devote time to it, to take a lead, to all, all the different accountability measures pushed on them. I think it absolutely takes courage. But I just also wanted to pick up the idea about knowledge and exclusivity of knowledge. And Camden has this knowledge quarter, which is all the different institutions I was talking about. And there was a discussion the other day about whether it was exclusive to call it the knowledge quarter and whether that cut some people out. And I was like, and my view is absolutely not, because everyone has knowledge to contribute and to share. And I think there's a kind of dangerous idea of, the knowledge is, some people have the knowledge over here and it's the kind of academic knowledge, because knife crime, social isolation, this gentleman talked about, the lived experiences of those issues are, for me, the most important pieces of knowledge in solving those issues. So Polymathy, can't quite get that right. I think it is, people having that pluralism and that openness, but I think that what the gentleman over there said about that coalition being really important, and actually together we make a polymath that will solve these issues. And if innovation is only focus on making our lives easier, there will be a lot of people left behind by that. So innovation needs to be focused on solving these problems and bringing people together.
Thank you. And Ella, I was going to ask you to comment on that question about, well, isn't the way to achieve polymathy through groups working effectively together rather than from heroic individuals who know an enormous amount?
Yes.
Thank you.
That's not the question that I wanted to answer.
No, you don't. You can ignore my question. No, it's fine. It's fine. You are plural. Feel free to ignore me.
So I'm actually also interested in this theory-practice question, because one of the things that I'm seeing in this space is that actually practice is still relegated. And so expertise is still associated with theory. And so you can have, I've been at events and I will have been in a room with practitioners who have 30 or 40 years experience and are experts. And then I see a 25-year-old graduate, perhaps doing his doctorate at Oxbridge, who is the one speaking on that podium, and he is the one with the credibility and the status, and people with 30 or 40 years practical experience are relegated. And I think this is very real. And so I think one of the challenges, and it speaks to what you were talking about, Georgia, in terms of inclusivity, is how we start to recognize and validate and reward very different kinds of expertise.
Wakas, here's a really simple question for you to end off with, which you can then ignore, just like Ella ignored my last question, which is, if Leonardo was here, how would he respond to this? What do you think?
I wondered if I could tackle one or two questions.
No, well, fair enough. No, absolutely.
And we can have a drink after. No, I will if we have time address that. But I wanted to just go back to the individual versus group interdisciplinarity, which is a very important point. I think, yes, group interdisciplinarity has its benefits, of course. But ultimately, we need to look at interdisciplinarity in the single mind vis-a-vis in a group mind. So in a group mind, what you have is you have a whole bunch of different people with their own expertise that they've probably gathered over a long career. So they're jealously going to guard that discipline, right? So that's their identity. So for them, they're the experts on the table, and anyone else that has anything to say about that discipline will often be seen skeptically or cynically and so on. So I think with groups, there is a danger of a group of egos sitting around a table, and therefore productivity and creativity not happening. But at the same time, how that can be made more effective is interdisciplinarity in a single mind, because when you're able to conduct a synthesis with your own self, you're of course battling your own ego rather than multiple egos, and you're drawing upon multiple strands of information in a unique way that's not possible in the real world. And then once you have that interdisciplinary mindset, you will then approach the group more empathetically, and therefore the conversation is likely to be more productive and creative. Sorry.
For 10 seconds, go on.
Always encourage collaboration, which in theory is a noble exercise, but in practice, I don't know how effective it can be. Very quickly, if I may, on universal basic income. I'm not going to talk about universal basic income, but I am going to talk about one very simple concept, which is, do we want to create a society that puts human potential at the heart of it, right? Do we want to do that? Because if we want to do that, yes, we will develop ways, models, economic theories, and so on that might unleash that, but that's got to be a goal. And human potential being unleashed in its entirety, and that speaks to the other question about automation, actually, because we don't currently know what a human mind is capable of. We're getting glimpses of it over history today through sparks of genius and so on, but have we fully investigated what the human mind is fully capable of through a rigorous education system based on human potential? Once we have that, then we can have that conversation about automation, machine versus human, and so on. But yes, if universal basic income, the issue with polymathy is that it has been unleashed through a process of hardship and necessity. So if somebody is seeking to survive, they often have to be creative to do so. So sometimes that encourages polymathy. But polymathy is also encouraged when you're in a position where you don't have to worry about your financial condition, and you therefore can explore. You can go on that adventure willingly out of necessity. So there's a discussion to be had about whether or not it unleashes polymathy.
Great, thank you very much. I'm sorry that we're out of time, but I never normally go late, but this has been a very special event, and so I don't apologise for going over a little bit. Thank you for fantastic questions that you asked. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, please stay and carry on the conversation. We've got drinks, so please stay for that. We'll be gathering in the long gallery in Rothmels, so you exit via the atrium door and walk downstairs to -2. There'll be staff to show you the way. Before we finish, I'd like to say a special thanks to Wakas, who first proposed tonight's event. And if you don't already have his book, The Polymath, do take the opportunity to get a copy tonight when you can have it signed by the author himself. It is a great insight into this topic. And sincere thanks also to our partners at the London Interdisciplinary School for all their support in bringing tonight's panel together and generously supporting that reception where you can hear the conversation about the relationship between seduction and knowledge. You'll meet members of the LIS team over drinks. I think they're all wearing name badges, so that's how you know they are. And you can find their website links on the events page on the RSA website. And of course, while you're at the RSA website, you can also find out lots more about the RSA and the projects that we're involved in, schools, businesses, communities, universal basic income across the UK and globally, supporting innovative and fulfilling new ways to live, learn, and work. I'm going to ask you to do 2 bits of thanks. One is a self-indulgent thing I do every year, but we have the most amazing events team in this organisation. This is the last event of this season, so I'd like you to give a round of applause to the RSA events team. And before you go off for your summer, please join me in thanking, I think, a really amazing panel we've had tonight. Wakas, Ella, Georgia, and Carl. It's been brilliant. Thank you.